Good morning, everyone. My name is Billy, and I am the founder and organizer of Bookstore Romance Day. I'd like to welcome everyone in the audience to our final panel for Bookstore Romance Day 2026 weekend. We are going to be talking about historicals beyond the Regency. Even though some of our authors have written in the Regency, I really want to focus on other time periods and other places than ballrooms in England. Um, I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank all of the authors who have participated, not just today and during this panel, but all weekend long, both virtually and those who have been doing store events throughout the country. I also want to thank all of our sponsors who make sure that we can continue to offer these virtual events free for people to attend. If you have questions for any of the authors, please put them in the Q&A. We will try to get to them at the end. I will be posting links in the chat where you can purchase the author's books. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to our moderator, Charlotte.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you to Billy for organizing today's panels. I'm Charlotte from the Garden District Bookshop in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I'm joined today with Eloisa James, Alex Campi, Liana Rosa, Katrina Jackson, and Alice Murphy. So, what's the Regency era? We talk about it all the time. What is it? It's a tiny little window from 1811 to 1820 in England when George, the Prince of Wales, is made Prince Regent over his father, King George III. Wherefore romance? Wherefore Regency in my romance novel? It's obvious that Jane Austen is the mother, the text, and she's a contemporary of the era. Or is it Georgette Heyer as the mother of the genre? Or is it Barbara Cartland's over 600 romance novels? Origins of romance, however, are not all Regency based. It's very easy to forget that romance is not and has never been a monolith. From the early bodice rippers, from Kathleen E. Woodiwiss to Trailblazer Beverly Jenkins with Night Song, to many of the authors here on this panel right now. Romance has always been looking past the ballroom and saying, should we get out of here? So I'm very excited for everyone to be here today. Let's start with what was your very first non-Regency romance novel you remember reading? Where was it set? What time period?
I'm fine to start. I came to romance and historical romance incredibly late. So my first historical romance was Alyssa Cole's Be Not Afraid, I believe. I'm a huge fan of her historical romances, and she was the gateway for me to see that romance could look like people like me.
If we're going to be really honest, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Do you want it to just each go or? Yeah. I think Charlotte is frozen. Well, anyway, my first romance was Georgette Heyer, These Old Shades, which is set in 1755. So it's Georgian. And the hero minces along in his red heels. And I had never imagined anything like it. I thought it was absolutely fabulous. And he was reading in every way to me at the time as kind of a fabulously queer guy, which he wasn't. He's the hero. But she was brave and historically accurate.
Georgette Heyer had she often gets called, one of the mothers of Regency romance, but my favorite works by her were much before that. Like, my queer-coded Georgette Heyer was The Masqueraders, which I just adore, which was set right after the Battle of Culloden, and involves like considerably more queer like cross-dressing than you would expect from a novel written in the late teens, early 20s. If we're really going to be like brutally honest about the very first non-Regency romance, it was probably some tattered copy of Gone with the Wind that was at at a camp. That didn't exactly convince me. I'm not a Gone with the Wind fan. um, for many, many reasons. But then I got into a lot of very romance adjacent books that were historically set. Samuel Shelley Prince of Foxes, everything Dorothy Dunnett has ever written. I highly recommend getting into Dorothy Dunnett. That just had a lot more that had a lot of plot and suspense along with usually a central romance. And for me, the politics kind of are the point. I love, one thing that always fascinates me about Regency romance is me the stereotype is that the authors do not engage with the politics at the time, although there are many who do engage with the politics. But it was that era and just before it was one of the most transformational eras politically for Britain. The War of 1812, Waterloo in 1815, the Slave Trade Act in 1807, the massive abolitionist movement had been growing in the UK, started among other people by Josiah Wedgwood of the Blue and White Dishes fame. Um, the formation of the West Africa Squadron, getting China addicted to opium so we could have tea, the expansion of the East India, the company Raj down the coast of India. Like there was so much going on, and people are like, it's ballrooms, and I'm just like, it's a lot of people doing very bad things overseas, and men coming back with PTSD from war. Like it is ballrooms, yes, but and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which would destroy the the foundation of the British, agricultural aristocracy in many ways. And so they were gone by, they were much faded by like the 1850s. So it is a really interesting period. And I choose non-Regency just because I fall in love with like the dynamics of a situation. Um, and those haven't been within Regency, but I could very much see myself, writing about someone, who captaining a ship in the West Africa Squadron, for example. Sorry, that was really long.
That's okay. Katrina, Liana, Alice, your first non-Regency romance novels you remember reading?
I um I want to say that I I read Jean Yule's. I might be mistaking that Clan of the Cave Bear.
Oh, I wasn't
Very
going to mention
very
that one. Yes.
I started reading that very young, like probably younger than I should have been. But also the amount of like historical details she put into those books, I absolutely loved. And I definitely carried that over into my own historicals. But when I rediscovered romances after I was well into adulthood and was a mom, I started with Scottish historicals. So a lot of books by like Hannah Howell and Mary Wine. And then I found Monica McCarty, and she was writing her very popular Highland Guard series was about the Scottish fight for independence. And again, she was weaving so much historical detail into her novels. And I just fell in love with it because not only was the history fascinating, but they were kissing and so much more.
Katrina, Alex, I mean, Elise.
I already went, so I think you were
You
frozen.
did.
So just,
I'm so
yeah,
sorry.
it's okay.
Um,
Um,
Go ahead.
I recall it being a book called To Catch a Pirate, which I believe was by Jade Parker. Um, I grew up kind of like I was like just turning to be a teenager around like the 2008 financial crisis. And for whatever reason, that was like a golden age for YA historical romance. So I think I was kind of always destined for my brain to be broken in this one specific way. And just like I read so many of them, like Meg Cabot wrote a bunch of YA like Regencies around that time. And I this one was set in like 1720, I think, and it's very Pirates of the Caribbean coded, like governor's daughter has to go chase a pirate who like, betrayed her family. And it was just delicious, like yum, 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 give me 15 more of these. And then I just did. I just kept reading books like that forever, pretty much. And yeah, I love it. I love hearing like all of our foundational texts. I think is such an interesting peek into the way that like the industry has changed, right? Like how the kinds of stories we are quote unquote allowed to tell in trad publishing in a historical context, but also like how that informed all of our individual approaches to the genre. Very cool.
Can you tell us how or when you knew that Regency romances weren't for you? Like, how did you know that this wasn't what you wanted to write about? Get for the group.
I still think I could write about it. Uh, because my love of that period was based around books like Bernard Cornwell's Sharp series. I was like reading the dad version of the Regency romance, which is like Sharp's Rifles, and the Aubrey Maturin books by Patrick O'Brien, which take place at the same time. They're just boys off fighting wars and falling in love rather than boys in ballrooms. But I wanted to do I've been doing a lot of medieval research for like another project, and I just wanted to write about knights. One of my foundational texts was also Howard Pyle's. I grew up in the Delaware Valley in southeastern Pennsylvania, and one of our local illustrators was Howard Pyle, who was a great like 1920s, 1930s illustrator of like kids books. And he did illustrated versions of the knights, the King Arthur stories, and I had read those and imprinted on those like a little baby duckling. And then I was always going to write a knight story. It's just that they kiss, the knights kiss.
I don't think I've ever been under the illusion I want to write in the Regency era. I am in my normal life a historian of African American and African diaspora history. I'm also technically a Black British historian as well. And while I'm interested in British history, it's not the Regency era. I'm a 20th century historian more than anything, which is why I really loved Alyssa Cole, who was my gateway into Beverly Jenkins and others, is that I wanted to write books where I could see people who looked like me or people who looked or who are from the African continent or its diaspora. And while there are Black people in Regency era England, I'm not interested in writing their particular stories because I'm interested in places where Black people are able to build community with one another. And so in that respect, I'm interested in places where they can be a statistical majority. I'm interested in places where they are able to build their own communities, et cetera. Um, and while that is possible in parts of Europe in the Regency era, I think as a scholar, more than anything, I looked at sort of historical romance and I could not imagine myself writing historical romance until I discovered Alyssa because I did not want to write a story that as I looked at historical romance, either I was writing or it would seem as if I could only write interracial romances, or I could only write romances where Black people were in a position where they were either one of a very few, if not the only. Part of why I love history itself, outside of the literature, is the ability for Black people is to interrogate the ways in which Black people build community. And so the Regency era was not personally a place I thought I could write the stories of my heart.
Well, I'll go next just because what you're saying, Katrina, is so interesting. I've been reading about Paris in particular and the freed blacks in Paris, which was an enormous community, and really a fascinating one. I, of course, have written a lot of Regency romance, so I'm going to just skew this slightly and say, why write something else? And for me, the first Georgian romances came around for me when Desperate Housewives was on television. And that's probably before the time of a bunch of you. But basically, I decided I wanted to have six duchesses who'd all left their husbands. And in the Georgian period, people left their husbands right and left and went off and then raised illegitimate children. It was very, very different than the Regency period. And so I started this series, Desperate Duchesses, and kept it going for 6 books. And it was a lot of fun because having written in the Regency period, the time earlier in the Georgian before the Regency was so much looser. So, for example, a man and woman could play chess together in a bedroom. That was fine. right? Because you're playing chess. Things like that could not really happen in the Regency period. And I wanted separated husbands. I wanted all kinds of stories that simply would not fit into the aristocratic life in the Regency. And because I'm a poet's daughter and I grew up on a farm, I am extremely uninterested in poverty or anything like it. So I use dukes as a shorthand for lots of money and lots of power, and I just moved from there. So I sort of got stuck in the nobility, but I wanted to find a time that was more interesting in terms of relationships between men and women, in terms of um, sex outside the bounds of marriage or despite marriage.
Yeah, I think to kind of build up on that, I think certain historical periods like kind of demand certain political conversations and thematic preoccupations. And I read so much Regency and I have read so much Regency that I kind of looked at the big canon of books and was like, do I actually have anything to say that no someone else hasn't already said, probably better than I would? And then I thought about, well, I, here are 16 thematic preoccupations I have. That one feels like a 1920s book. That one feels like a 1960s book. That one feels like Gilded Age New York. And so to me, it's more driven not by like kind of what the set decoration is, but like what is the story that I'm trying to tell and where's the most appropriate place to tell that story and to have those conversations. But if I'm thinking about a very specific moment, it was probably like 2015 on Twitter. I read a thread of a woman saying she was never going to read this one Regency romance author again, who I don't even remember who it was. But she was like, she used the wrong form of formal address, and therefore I can never trust what this person has ever written about a duke ever again, and I will never read them again. And I was like, that's too high a bar to clear. Absolutely not. Elise is not going to know how to address a Viscount ever in her entire life. If I ever do learn that information, you guys should just know that like something's wrong with me. I've been kidnapped and I'm trying to signal that I am kidnapped and need help. So I was like, in America, the streets are paved with cheese. There are no rats, and I don't have to learn how to address a duke. So that those were my one is a serious answer and one's a silly answer, but I do feel them both very strongly.
Most of my books are inspired by historical events that I just personally find very interesting. And so, regardless of what time frame I'm writing in, it's usually inspired by that. And notably, most of the books I've written have been set in the Victorian era, just because we're talking about many years, right, to play with. And so my most recent series is The Luna Sisters, which literally started with me um, being interested in the second Mexican Franco War, and it blossomed from there. And I was fascinated by what was happening within the world at the time with the US Civil War, obviously the war in Mexico, and other greater movements happening throughout the globe. And I just wanted to play with it. And I did it in the form of playing with these three sisters who moved from Mexico to London during this time and what that meant. My next series that I'm working on is set in the 1890s because they're mountain climbers. And so I had to really do research about when is it feasible to set the series? When was mountaineering really becoming popular? And when is it viable for me to set the series in Nepal? And then I kind of built everything, all the world building and everything from that point on. So I did write briefly, well, I say the late Regency, it was in the 1830s. And I specifically wrote in that time frame because of political movements that were happening at that time. But the fashion was terrible, in my opinion, at that time. I much rather have set it further into the Regency where those beautiful empire dresses. But alas, I wanted to talk about specific political movements, and so I had to do it in the 1830s. But I don't have any plans to do Regency anytime soon. There's so many other fascinating times in history that I want to play with, but I do still love reading a good Regency.
Alice, one of the one when my book first came out, it's set in the early 1300s. Someone took me to task on, I think it was still Twitter, that I'd use the word pandemonium, which is a word that John Milton created for Paradise Lost. And like, I don't know if I can read this because, and I literal historians jumping into the mentions going, oh, so you want her to write it in like Middle English, like the Green Knight. And the person was like, oh, blah, 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 blah. So, my feeling is as long as you're making an effort, the people who actually do history for a living are like, yeah, you're good. Like, I'm just happy to see you made an effort and I'm enjoying this. It's there are joyless people who will always try to find some error. And I'm sorry for them that they're like that because they must have a very disappointing life.
To give the devil her due, is there anything from Regency romance novels as a reader or as a writer that you have incorporated into your non-Regency books?
No.
I love it.
I think there is something interesting to be said about kind of, to Eloise's point about, you at one point you could have two people in a room playing chess because, it's a bedroom, but it doesn't matter because it's the Georgian era. Like there is something about the performative pressure cooker of a Regency courtship that I do find very delicious. I've never incorporated it in one of my books, but I do love it. I do think it's very fun every once in a while to be like, but what if I did have to marry this man because he looked at me for slightly too long in a ballroom? What if? I think that can be fun every once in a while.
Yeah, I have to say I would agree with that. I go back and forth between the Regency and the Georgian period. Right now, I have a Gothic adjacent series at the moment. The Last Lady B is setting in the Regency period, but I also have a series coming out in the Georgian period. And what the Regency gives you is this stricture. And I always think of romance as like this thing that people think of as being very conservative and very unoriginal. But in fact, it is much harder to be original within strict bounds than it is for a literary author who can just kill off like four people and then call it a day and say, oh, I'm so original, I killed off this kid. Whereas we can't kill children, we can't kill cats, we have trouble with someone who kicks a dog. I mean, everybody knows the end. And if you add the Regency onto that, you have an even more strict plot, box that you're working with. And if you just take something and you add, say, a fairy tale like Cinderella into a Regency, we're getting more and more strict. How original can you be within that? How much can you actually dazzle and surprise the reader? I think it's a huge challenge. And I think the Regency is a bigger challenge than the Georgian period, particularly for people who maybe aren't, that into historical detail. But I love the challenge. I think it's a lot of fun. I think also there are certain in the same way that you can have more exuberant sex, maybe out of marriage sex in the Georgian period, you can have something that, like it or not, readers really like, which is, a very aggressive hero. We might wish that people didn't like a possessive whatever hero. That works very well in a Regency setting. Um, so just leave it.
We're going to transition to more specific author questions now. Liana, you've written about your love of romance novels that are built around families. You've talked about Lisa Kleypas's The Hathaways. You've talked about the Bridgertons. When you were creating your Luna Sisters trilogy, were there any other classic tenets of historical romance that you were ready to really put your own spin on? How was it different for each sister? How did that go for you?
Honestly, when I was writing the Luna Sisters, I wasn't thinking about any other family group. I enjoy reading them, but I wasn't necessarily thinking about them. I was thinking about how daughters interact in a Latina household. How does um, how would three daughters who were born to a very powerful Mexican man who gained his power through a lot of perseverance, overcoming a lot of racism, classism, other isms you can think of, and is desperate to hold on to it in a culture that values producing sons, right? This very machismo, atmosphere. How would these three daughters navigate that? And I liked to play with the idea of each of the sisters, like, what does it mean to be raised by the same parents in the same household and be so very different, right? And have a different experience with your parents, and what that means when you're no longer under their thumb and you can make something of yourself because you're literally an ocean away from them, right? And what sort of steps you would take to be your own person. These were all things that I thought of. And frankly, birth order played a big part of it. And maybe it's because I'm an eldest daughter, right? Um, like I said, in a Latina household. And so I poured a lot of that eldest daughter mentality into the very first book, Ana Maria and the Fox. She's the eldest daughter. What would that mean for her to be sent away in the middle of the night under the threat of war? And she has to look out for her younger sisters, and she's leaving behind a fiance, and like what all of that meant. And then I did the same thing with the second book. Isabel is the middle child, and she's kind of overlooked, and she's the one that looks more like their indigenous roots. And what does that mean for her and how she views the world and how she views her position in the family? And those were the sort of things that I played with and had fun with. And I think that's why I like sibling series so much, because you can all come from the same place and be so very different. And why? And how does that affect how you view the world? And I think that's why I love, reading the Hathaways, and, there's so many other series revolving around families. But I think that's kind of the sort of family dynamics that I enjoy playing with and that I played with the Luna sisters.
Nice. Katrina, in both Back in the Day and A Blue Note, you utilize multiple timelines. Both books contrast what's happening in the present day to the 1960s and the 1930s, respectively. What does integrating the present day with the past illuminate?
So I think some of that is the fact that I'm a historian and a history professor. I'm always trying to make history relevant to my students. And one of the ways I tend to do that is family histories, having them think about their own family histories, and encouraging them to ask questions of their elders, as I am doing currently. And so both books are really about sort of in singular families, like how we can think about the past and what lessons it can teach us about today. Um, because I think the past, especially in this current political moment, the past is incredibly relevant. How we talk about the past is incredibly relevant. Um, and I realized, because I at first did not want to write historicals of any kind, that as I think Alice was saying, that I wanted to tell a story that only I could tell, right? Instead of telling a story that maybe someone else has told before and told better. And for me, especially for Black histories, like telling stories about the present and the past felt incredibly important and in some cases urgent.
And taking the two, you're dealing with in Back in the Day, you're dealing with a father and son versus in A Blue Note with more of an individual self-discovery. Was it was it that was it like a clear distinction, or do you find that like one book it's more about this and the other one or that is a separate idea? Is it a blending of the two?
A blending of the past and the present, you mean?
No, I'm sorry. I meant narratively. Like, do you find that you like to keep it separate in one book and then another, or is it really the same core story for both?
Oh, no, they're two very different stories. I think in Back in the Day, what I was trying to really think about, that story is about a man his wife has recently passed and he is moving out of their home. And he wants to take the record collection that they built together as like a sort of timeline of their love story, as a remnant of that, because they met at a music festival. He is a music writer and she was a photographer. And so he is trying to get his son to understand like why this record collection means so much to him. Whereas in a Blue Note, what I was really thinking of is the ways in which the main character, Pauletta, who is herself sort of dealing with the aftermath of a suicide attempt, can sort of learn what it means to live again, to find herself again by looking at her great aunt, who was a masculine lesbian trumpet player in the Harlem Renaissance, what it can look like to be fully herself. So they are two very sort of distinct stories about what we can learn from the past, but ultimately, which is the sort of thrust of my own academic work as well, that the past sort of has a considerable amount to sort of teach us about the present. So that is sort of the core theme. But what that looks like, I also just love music, obviously. Clearly, like that is a sort of central theme. But this sort of idea of mental health and sort of what it looks like for a young woman today to sort of navigate that in a space and to look back at the past, especially for a queer ancestor, I think was really important for me, as opposed to a very personal and intimate narrative about what a family looks like, not only in the making, but also in the aftermath of losing a loved one.
Alex, we've talked a little already about historical romance and politics, and medieval is always rife. And like sometimes it can seem silly to be like, oh no, we're from rival clans and now we're forced to get married by this new king. Or I now own your home because the king said so. I'm saying that in a silly way, but oftentimes these politics are actually deeply life threatening. For you, when you were working on The Scottish Boy, how were you balancing the very serious life threatening stakes of The Scottish Boy with two men falling in love? How were you balancing that?
Uh, I mean, mostly it was done on vibes, but you know, my books always have a lot of action and a lot of suspense, along with the romance. I wanted to set it somewhere where, I mean, ultimately Ian is Harry's prisoner for a while. So there's elements there's a power dynamic there, which it almost required very serious circumstances to exist. And, Ian spends about half his time trying to get away and is successful multiple times. Um, before, they both sort of realize the forces arrayed against them are so awful that the best thing they can do is kind of team up, and bide their time to work against the very, very entrenched politicians who are, in their own view, doing everything they can to keep this, to keep the English kingdom intact, through very, very underhanded means during a time of great transition. I mean, people think of the English throne as something that kind of persisted for a very long time, and it in fact did not. I mean, there are many periods like the anarchy without a king, pretenders with France invading a few times. So there's, they're always in the early and high medieval era, there are a lot of opportunities for extremely stressful, life-threatening situations that just come naturally out of the political environment at the time and people trying to hold a country together that was not necessarily um, going to hold together.
Question for Alice. When people think of the Gilded Age in New York, it's always tinged with some kind of glamour. You've got your $1 million princesses, your fabulous Worth gowns, the Astor family. It not to quote Stefano, but like it has everything. It's all glamour. So with that in mind, why would you choose to write about a vaudeville star whose career is dying and is going out of fashion? Why was it important for you to write about a heroine who is so determined to break the status quo?
Oh, I love that question. I think going back to, how you kind of choose where you're going to set your story or when you're going to set your story, I love to write about like cultural inflection points. Like when were we as people grappling with a new introduction to our society? And one thing that's really interesting, the more you read about kind of, because Evelyn, our heroine, is like a plus size vaudeville star. And the more you read about kind of the history of like how we think about like fatness and size and beauty, not just in America, but across the world, so much of how we view it is informed by politics. And it's informed by who is the outgroup at any given time, who do we wish to vilify. And, we are living in a current dystopia where, fatness is decided to be something that is on the outs. We're getting the kind of Ozempic era is in at a same time where fascism is rising and where body policing is very intense. And uh, so much of that is wrapped up in like the demonization of immigration and immigrants. And I wanted to write a story about, the Gilded Age is literally called the Gilded Age because on the top it was beautiful and underneath it's rot, right? It's just wood. And so I feel like I was writing it in a moment where America felt like that again. We have Met Galas and we have crushing medical debt. And I wanted to write a book about two people who are grappling with that moment where it's like everything, it's like the rug has been pulled out underneath me so shockingly. How am I going to love another person in a context where it feels like the entire world doesn't love me anymore all at once? And believe it or not, that actually turns out to be kind of a fun book. And I also think, like setting it with a vaudeville heroine in particular, like the Gilded Age it was about show, right? Everything underneath is garbage, but on the surface it all looks beautiful and we're all rich and we're all thriving. And isn't that great? Um, that's what vaudeville is. Vaudeville is smoke and mirrors and feathers and sequins covering up terrible working conditions and ungodly hours and, exploitation and abuse. And I don't know, I kind of wanted to talk about artifice all the way down. And somehow in there managed to get like her getting banged on a ride at Coney Island and elephant rides, We got to have it all, right? We have to we have to feed our souls in both directions.
One last individual question. We'll go back to group questions. For Eloisa, you've used fashion in so many ways in both your Regency novels and in your non-Regency ones. Um, you could say you have a passion for fashion if you'll let me make one small joke. Your Regency heroines have used fashion as affirmation, as confidence builders, whether it's a total makeover or wetting your petticoats for one evening out. But, and I'm going to use Born to be Wild as a more specific example from your vast catalog. Born to be Wild is Georgian, and you have a heroine who has her back against the wall. She has nothing left. And so she discovers that being a personal stylist is a skill and a power that she can use to save herself. As you've written non-Regency books throughout your years, how have you taken something that you care so deeply about, fashion, and made it into a new exploration for yourself with every book?
That's a really good question. I just want to say first, like all these books sound so fascinating. I don't read historicals because I have a very leaky voice and I'll start sounding like, whoever I'm reading. But wow, they sound amazing. And I love them, love the sound of all of them. When it comes to fashion, I'm a bit um, on the one side you have your personal history, right? Which is that, like I told you, I grew up on a farm and my mother made like my dress out of the curtains of the dining room one year when we were going to school. And I loved clothes. I wanted clothes like the other girls had so much. So that there's that. And I don't want to make myself sound like the glass castle or anything here because it was just totally loving household. And my mother was actually a pretty good seamstress. But the that love of clothing took me forward. And then what came also is that while I am a historical romance writer, I'm also a professor, a Shakespeare professor, and that leads itself to a certain uneasiness when things are really unhistorically accurate. And so whereas other authors are more able to say, oh, my heroine in 1812, it's going to be she's going to be a robber and she's going to be climbing roofs. And I'm always looking for the thing that women were actually doing at the time, the way they were making money at the time. I find that fascinating. I read as many diaries as I can, and I've found tons of women doing all kinds of things and making a lot of money doing it. And the era, sort of the arena of fashion, the modistes, the women who worked on embroidery, we're talking harrowing hard work and up all night making not just fashion, but all the accoutrement of fashion. So gum paste flowers, feathers, all of that. A lot of that was women actually running workshops, and shops of their own. And so on the one side, it works historically for me as a way of kind of exploring women's agency, not just with their own bodies, but with how they can make money. As you're saying, in the whole thing about Born to Be Wild is she realizes her mother's addicted and she has got to get money. And so she goes to a man and she says, will you marry me? And he says, no. And it's a great way to start a book. I was like, yes. And I was like, what the heck do I do now? So that's where that came from. It's like, how can a woman actually make money at the time if you need a lot of money?
So back to our group questions. And by the way, everyone, if you have not put a question in the Q&A, now would be a great time as we get close to the end of our time with our amazing panelists. So for the group, is there a historical era or a country that you have not yet seen historical romance tackle? Because I'm dying to know about this historical novel set in Nepal, Liana. I cannot wait for that one. So I want to know what everybody else is like. Damn, why haven't they done this yet?
I'll just say, I mean, um, there are so many countries.
Yeah.
And it seems like we're kind of like we need to narrow that down. It seems to me what you're asking is what has traditional American publishing done? There's a lot of romances being written in other countries that are really fascinating that just don't make it to our country. And I've been lucky enough to have conversations, for example, with Chinese romance writers and all kinds of romance writers writing wonderful stuff that it just isn't translated into English. Though, who knows? Maybe it will start being.
Yeah,
And medieval stuff,
unfortunately. Oh, sorry.
medieval stuff, they just tend to add a little bit of magic and they call it romantasy in their advanced doubles. So, put in a talking cat or a wand and you're away. But the one, I mean, I've been playing with ideas of what my next book's going to be about, and I've been thinking about queer romance during the Fourth Crusade, which is like just a mess. It was horrific. The Crusades were just the West won the first one mostly out of surprise, and then just lost from there. And they were a terrible part of world history, and the Fourth Crusade especially. Um, but I wanted to have the lead character's brother murdered, and then the murderer goes on the Crusades because, of course, you're cleansed of all sin if you go and kill the infidel, which is a whole nother debate. And so the lead character joins the crusade to track down a murderer. I've also been fascinated by the fact that in the early 1970s, if you were queer, you couldn't get a liquor license because you had to be an upstanding moral character to get a liquor license in New York City, which essentially meant that if you were queer or otherwise marginalized, your bar in the area you hung out in was owned by the mob. So all of the the West Village, all the bars around Christopher Street, the queer bars, were all owned by the mob. Um, and that made for some interesting bedfellows, to say the least. So, what do you do when you're uh, campaigning for queer acceptance and queer rights? And I mean, they're stories at the time of the second Pride Parade, which I think was 1972. Everyone complaining that it was too corporatized because the mob had floats. But history is like constantly wonderful and surprising and terrifying, and there's just so much you can do in so many periods if you just dig around a bit.
I just want to say the 70s is not too recent to be historical as a historian of the post-civil rights movement. And then with that, I'll say I'd like to echo Eloisa. Like, I don't presume to know like all the books that have been written and have not been translated and have not sort of made it across my consciousness. But I do think that regardless of the country, I think there are so many stories as yet to be told, right? So I'm really invested. It's only within my lifetime. Yeah, I know. I get it. And yet, I think that there are so many stories to be told. I'm really interested in stories set in slavery in the US. Like, I really think that this is a place where not just traditional publishing, but I think a lot of historical romance authors have been sort of nervous about treading and doing it well, even though there are sort of a number of stories that I think maybe should not have been published as is. But I think that there's so many stories, so many romantic stories set in slavery amongst enslaved people that historians themselves have been writing about in so many ways, and yet we have not seen the sort of jump to literature, at least in historical romance, historical fiction possibly, but not historical romance. And so I really would love to see that. I am also a 20th century historian, so I would love more stories set in the 1970s and after. Um, and then for me personally, also, I'm really interested in stories set in pre-colonial Africa, or at least that engage pre-colonial Africa and the African diaspora, whether it's the transatlantic slave trade or the movement of African and African descended peoples around the world in with one another. There's hilariously, it's only in Spanish, it has not been translated, but there is a story about two Garveyites in South America who engage one another from an Afro-Caribbean standpoint and also sort of mainland South America that I am just really hoping someone will translate one day so that I can read it. There are so many stories to be told, and historians are doing the work, and historical romance authors could absolutely be pulling on some of that research for inspiration.
Katrina, there's an amazing Reddit thread which I have to dig up where like on Nigerian Reddit they were like, like how did the slave trade affect your family? And it quickly devolves into, oh yeah, and we killed him and dumped him in the back of the swamp, and everyone knows not to go there. And I'm like, you go. But it was
Please send it to
fascinating.
me. Please send it
I'm
to
going to
me. I would
find
love
it
to
and
read
send it to
it.
you. It's extremely satisfying.
I don't know the name of that book, but I will find it and send it to the moderators and they can add it. I don't know off the top of my head.
Love it. I would love, I think broadly speaking, I'd love to see more 20th century romance in general. Like I agree. I think it's like a really kind of untapped wealth of really interesting story points. Like I I'm really interested in the Great Depression. I would love to write something set in the Great Depression, especially when we think of how much of like our romantic storytelling texture is informed by wealth and power disparities. Think of how many women have to get married because their dad's will says so, or I need health insurance or whatever. Like I think setting something in such an extreme period of wealth inequality would be really fascinating. I'm also interested in, I would love to do something set in the Revolutionary War. We literally have a piece of our Constitution that says, like, you can't quarter soldiers in my house. And I'm like, but what happened to the woman who had to have a soldier quartered in her house? What if he was big and strong and handsome? And then they were on different sides of a war. That could be fun for a romance. And then I'm also really interested in stories set like after, right? So like we have a lot of stories set like during a war, but like what happens when the guy you married randomly on a 3-day pass in Paris is now back on your farm in Nebraska and he's like in your house and you're married? Like, what's that like? Like, what what is the aftermath of these big kind of cultural moments where you like roll the dice and you're like, okay, well, he's probably going to die in a war anyway, so it doesn't even matter. We might as well get married. What happens after? What happens when you have to deal with the repercussions of the thing that you chose, whether that is like on a big cultural standpoint of like, how do we deal with the aftermath of war, but also how do I deal with the aftermath of the decisions I made in it? I think would be really fun kind of entry points for more romantic storytelling.
I was going to say, you mentioned Nepal. Obviously, I have a series coming set in Nepal, but I will say I have a future female main character for that series who's from South America. And I'm pretty sure I know where. But I'm really excited to like do the research into what was happening during that time. Um, and how that's going to look. And if I'm going to set any scenes there, I don't know, but I'm excited about the possibility of learning something new about somewhere new that I haven't, spent a lot of time researching. So that's, as you can tell, is kind of what motivates me is learning something new about somewhere new and how can I incorporate that into a book?
We've had some questions in the Q&A. One of them wanting to know about what's everybody's next releases, and additionally wanting to know about is there an appetite as an author or in the industry for historical romances about the rest of us instead of your upper crust landed gentry. And we've talked a little about like throughout about an interest beyond our dukes and beyond our ballrooms. Does anybody have anything additional they want to say about these about a hunger for romance novels, not about the rich or the privileged?
I have a deep, deep hunger for as many books about non-wealthy people as possible. I love books about working class people. I love books about enslaved people. I love books about regular people. It's one of the reasons why I find Alyssa Cole and Beverly Jenkins so important. Um, but also as a historian, I think that we tend to tell history, obviously, right, like only from the sort of upper echelons of society, ignoring the ways in which like sort of mass movements of people can change the sort of trajectory of history, but also the way that someone's singular life or a sort of an entangled sort of series of lives um, that are, even if they don't change the world, worthy of knowing, if nothing else.
Definitely. And I think we see it, I see it and encounter it mostly in indie publishing, which I think there's been like a really great flourishing market for indie romances that like speak to experiences and love stories of the non-wealthy. I think of authors like Catherine Grant, who like does have some aristocracy, but also has like some working class stories. I think about books like A Striking Romance, which if you were like a Newsies girly, like you must get A Striking Romance. It is for the Newsies fanfic girly out there, aka me. Aaron Langston, like I think we are seeing more in the indie space. Not that like writers don't have interest in it in the trad space, but I think trad has a very particular idea of what they envision the historical romance reader wanting. And so they aren't really willing to roll the dice on to just like normal people falling in love in a year that happens to not be 2026. So I think if you are interested, like really engaging with the indie historical romance community, where you can find it, would be a great place to start. But yeah, I definitely would love to. I mean, most of my characters were working class, and then a rich man just happened to walk in and be like, "I'm in love with you now." That's their fault. That's on them. I didn't pick that. That's on them. But no, I think in the future, it's definitely something that I want to explore more and really push more. Is just kind of normal people falling in love while wearing cool outfits in a time period that I'm interested in. What is like the American Girl doll romance series? Like I want my books to look kind of like that, like where we have just a really big breadth of times and places and parts of the human experience. That would be my answer.
I guess I'll play devil's advocate and say I don't think that trad publishing does. I mean, I'm going off what you said, Alice, but I don't think there is a lot of space at the moment for ordinary people falling in love in the historical romance genre. And I think the reason for that is I think it's been tagged as escapist, right? It was, I think, ordinary people falling in love is tagged as literature. That and I don't know that that's necessarily a terrible thing, to be honest, because I think that literary readers have a wider sort of grasp and acceptance and accept a wider span of time and economic situations. I mean, I think it's unfortunate trad is like that, but I think what like so I'm publishing now with Simon Schuster. I left HarperCollins after like 20 years. So I've seen these guys operating and they have a very narrow scope. And it's getting more narrow every freaking second, I also say. Having just sort of created my own genre, this sort of gothic romp, gothic adjacent. I mean, I basically had to elbow my way in there to write The Last Lady B, and I'm elbowing even harder now. Um, and you know, they don't sell the same as a straightforward historical romance, right? And that's a
What
problem.
happens is the marketing person goes in and they go, what are the comps for this?
Yeah,
And because there
there are
isn't
no
a
comps.
successful book that exists already like it, you have two problems. You have often a very non-diverse editorial group who look at a book and say, well, that isn't for me, so I can't see the audience for it. Um, and then when you do have editors who are like, I can totally see the audience for this, you get the marketing, you get the accountants who go in and say, well, there's no comp for that. That doesn't mean there's no audience for it. It just means that the publisher can't be sure that they will find that audience, and they might have to do something like actually market the book, and that makes they're very allergic to that. Um, so, that doesn't mean the books can't succeed. The books can succeed, Scottish Boy, we kept being told there were no comps for it because there were no other medieval romances, and or medieval queer romances, and we were just early. And the book's done incredibly well. The book sold on word of mouth. It was been republished on word of mouth. And many years later, the demand is still very, very strong for it now that it's being reprinted. But it's a slightly harder journey. And so luckily there is a world outside. Trad is wonderful. If they don't see your book, there is a world outside of it of indie publishing. There's nothing wrong with writing a romance set with ordinary people and having your agent take it to literary. Literary is a good audience. And they, as you say, they are more accepting of it being less of like a specific comfort read where, the heroine ends up being wealthy and comfortable. Um,
Yeah, I think that's why I like kind of rang the bell for like indie romance, which is that like what we have seen across the board in romance publishing is whatever is popular in indie is going to get cannibalized by trad pub because Alex, to your point, no one wants to market. And if there's already a built-in audience for it, we can just swipe that thing and put it on the shelves at Barnes and Noble, and we're going to have a TikTok certified banger on our hands. And so I think
yeah.
if you are a
Hence a lot of the
person,
pull to publish of fanfic,
right?
which is
So yeah,
a whole
and
other
it's
phenomenon.
a whole other thing and a whole other kettle of fish. And I think if you are a reader who's like, this is something that I am passionate about getting more of, then you need to find it where it is, which is an indie. And then once it is a big enough success, the theory goes, or the hope goes perhaps, that then trad is going to say, oh, people are actually interested in romances beyond the Regency ballroom, and then we
There's a
can build
comp.
out. Yeah, then there's a comp. We have it. It was a big indie hit. You're going to want this indie hit to be on your shelves. You want the next version of that thing. Like, I think everybody is worried about being like the last to the party. And it's like, okay, well, we need to start throwing the party ourselves. And then trad is going to start chasing.
Exactly.
Um,
But what it means also as you as readers is if you find an indie book you love, like tell everyone, like leave your Goodreads review, leave an Amazon review, help us defeat the mighty algorithm. Post on your socials about it. Like that really matters. Like it costs you if you read the book and you love it, it costs you nothing but a little bit of time, and it can really help get word out because no, there's very little marketing um, that's
Yeah,
going on.
I want to add one thing to that, two things. One is that HarperCollins just hired someone at the senior editor level who comes from Amazon, who her entire, I guess, job is going to be buying print versions of ebooks, right? Means basically she's going to be buying indie books. But then the second thing is I just read a really interesting article saying that AI is changing the way in which people search for books. So they used to go on Amazon and say, I want a Scottish romance. Now they go on ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and they say, I want a book just like Alice Murphy's X, Y, and Z. In other words, they're looking for much more explicit. I want a queer romance set in the Middle Ages in the time of the Crusades with a knight. And then AI is like looking for it and doesn't distinguish between trad and indie, and it's going to really change the publishing market in the next 5 years. So it's just something to think about that I find fascinating.
Can I say, as an indie writer, I think there's something to be said for the ways in which, like, we can, as readers, also like ask for more from our romances, right? Like, it is not dawned on me, right, that like I'm the only person in here talking about Black people in history, right? Like, and while there are a few historical romances, like we still sort of really sort of put Beverly Jenkins like sort of up at the sort of pinnacle of historical romance, Black historical romances, right? And while there are other Black historical romance authors in traditional publishing, many of them have moved to historical fiction. So I think for readers who love historical romance and would like to see it sort of bounce back and sort of make a resurgence after the last few years, I think um, eh, it can behoove us to widen our scope for what happily ever after looks like, what whose stories deserve to be told, and also like where not just the sort of books we're championing, but also like sort of questioning our idea of like what history can look like. Like as a historian, I am often sort of frustrated by the ways in which historical romance readers have talked about that sort of narrow sort of definition of what historical romance is or what it can be, especially even considering its own history. It has narrowed over the last few decades. It used to be a sort of far broader field. And I think if you are a reader who loves historical romance, I think this is a great time to read the classics if that is something that matters to you. And sort of learn what the sort of subgenre has looked like over the decades, but also to then kind of read outside of your comfort zone, right? Like to really think about what are the core themes you love about historical romances. Maybe it's the dresses and ball gowns, or maybe it's the sort of structure of the Regency era, or maybe it's simply that this is a um, um, historical romances offer a different perspective of what love can look like from the modern era. And if that is a thing you love, then that actually is a wide open field. You might find books you love from all different kinds of writers, from in all different kinds of settings.
And I think to piggyback on that, one of the best things about Bookstore Romance Day and one of the things about particularly indie booksellers is, and of course our beloved librarians who are romance literate, like all of the people who are kind of out there who can sit with a reader in a shop or next to a shelf in a library and say, oh, well, you really liked this book with these tropes, but you've never read a Katrina Jackson. You need to read this, like something that they otherwise would never have picked up, but because the bookseller is passionate and literate and read deeply in the genre and knows what this reader is looking for, they can then put these exciting books that they otherwise may never have picked up. Like that's one of the things that I love the best about going to an indie bookstore that like is passionate about the genre, right? Is that then I can have those conversations and be like, I know that my scope is this big, yours is this big. What do I need to pick up next? And the best booksellers are the ones who can take the one little thing you love about the genre and say, and I'm going to open up a whole door to 70,000 other books that I just know you're going to love that you never would have picked up otherwise. Um, So yeah, thanks to all of our booksellers and great librarians and folks out there who do that work as well. Oh, and someone shouted out Addie Duloc in the comments, and I will also say that Addie Duloc is excellent. I second that rec for sure.
So we unfortunately, and I say unfortunately for me and for everybody watching the panel, we have come to the hour. We've come to our close. One final, can everybody tell us about either your most recent release or your next upcoming release really quickly before we all have to say goodbye?
I can go. Sorry, Eloisa.
No, go.
I have a book out on Tuesday. It is
Oh,
my debut contemporary romance. And for any historical lovers, I will say the female main character is a content creator who highlights the theft of women in history. They're like discoveries or their contributions to science and whatnot. So I crammed a lot of historical figures into my contemporary novel. And so it's called Mutual Discord and it's out on Tuesday.
Yeah, you've stepped in contemporary, but you're still ours. You're still ours in the historical world, Liana.
yeah, but show us the cover. It's right
Oh,
there behind you.
ooh, she's gorgeous.
Oh, lovely.
Clinch covers forever.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go. So I have The Last Lady Bee is it came out in May. So my next one is a Kickstarter and it's called the Rejected series and it's set in the Georgian period. And because it doesn't have an editor, because I could just do myself, so it opens up with historical sections because this is a family that has been fighting since the time of Henry VIII. So it opens up with little historical sections written by a graduate student desperate to pay her student loans. And it's kind of satirical. And then the story, and then it moves forward, but all the stories are connected. And if you'd like to know more about it, please sign up on eloisajames.com because this whole Kickstarter thing is so much fun and so different for me, and I'm loving it. It's going to be hardcover in a box with like amazing antique shoes that I am stealing the bookmark idea from the Louvre in Paris. They came up with it. I'm adopting it. It's going to be great.
I love Kickstarters. They're so fun. Like I also write graphic novels, and we're working on a graphic novel that's a heist story set in early 13th century and has a major Jewish character in it because there were a lot of like very, very prominent Jewish women in English culture and the English economy in the early, like just around 1210 up until around, like 1240s. A friend of mine's a historian of early Anglo-Jewish women's history. So she influenced me. Um, but the book I have out right now that is being republished after its British publisher unfortunately met a bitter end is The Scottish Boy. It comes out in the print edition in the US on September 1st. There's an ebook soon to follow afterwards. There's already a very good audiobook out, really wonderfully read by a man named Richard Pierce. If you are a bookseller and you want to sell signed editions, I have little book plates I can send you. I'll sign them with my very fancy fountain pen and my dark green colored ink or whichever ink I have in the pen at the moment. The Scottish Boy is about a young man who becomes a knight from a poorer family. He's not from a very rich noble family. He's from a poorer farming family, and ends up being taken on what he thinks is going to be this mission of great importance with all these very highfalutin knights. And he very quickly finds out that knighthood is not nearly what it has been advertised, and that chivalry is a tale made up to tell the people back home. And ends up with a young Scottish prisoner that he is told to hang on to for and not really disclosed why. And he's to make the prisoner his squire. And it goes on from there in the early 14th century, and there are tournaments and betrayals and skullduggery, and lots of mutual pining, and wars.
Oh no, that sounds so terrible. I cannot wait for that to come to the Garden District Bookshop.
My latest release is called A Blue Note, and it is a dual timeline historical about a woman who has recently received her PhD in history. But the process was harrowing. And so, as she sort of finds herself as a new academic, she sort of delves into her own family history, specifically the history of her great aunt, who was a masculine lesbian trumpet player in the Harlem Renaissance. And through that research, she discovers a really tender lesbian romance between two Southern women in the North who are discovering themselves in the freedom of New York.
It's so good. I mean, all these books are very good, but it's so good. So I just released a book called A Showgirl's Rules for Falling in Love, which is like Moulin Rouge meets The Gilded Age. And it has like a modern day frame story as well, with its own little love story. And it briefly launched a conspiracy theory that I was Taylor Swift, which was like a very fun 48 hours. So if you want to know what all the fuss is about, then pick that up. And then my next release, is a book called A Modern Girl's Guide to Love and Divorce. And it's about it's set in the 1960s in like kind of the magazine world. And it's two rival journalists on opposite sides of the battle of the sexes, whose editor forces them to get married to report from the front lines of the modern American marriage. And they both secretly vow to drive the other person to divorce first. So it's like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days meets like Down with Love, or like a Hepburn Tracy or a Doris Day Rock Hudson movie. It's very fun. They have a atomic bomb scare at one point, and they hook up in a bomb shelter. So if that sounds like your jam, if you were a Grease 2 fan, you're gonna love it. And yeah, go read all the amazing books by these wonderful authors. I cannot believe I pulled the lottery ticket and got to be part of this. So thank you all for having me, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Charlotte and Garden District Books, for hosting, and Bookstore Romance Day for having us all.
Yes, everyone, please go to bookshop.org and order the books from our amazing authors today. Go to Libro FM. Please support your local indies, your local romance shops. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Billy, who is the queen, the ruler of Bookstore Romance Day.
Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. Thank you to all of these authors. My TBR is very much larger now, and I have an email that I'm going to be sending out with the links to this panel that includes as many of the authors and books that y'all talked about as I could get down while also trying to pay attention. So thank you all so much. This was a fantastic conversation. And thank you to everyone who has participated in Bookstore Romance Day over the weekend. The 1,032 bookstores in 6 countries around the world. All of the readers who have shopped, all of the attendees who have come to these virtual events, all of the sponsors who have made this possible. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And thus comes to a close Bookstore Romance Day 2026. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.